after rights, the right to not have to participate.
Exactly. It's a really interesting thing. I don't know if we're going to get off on this today, but there's also just a very big distinction factually in American society between marriage, which is a question that you were just discussing a moment ago. The Supreme Court essentially said there's a fundamental right of two people to get married. And this transgender issue, which is actually an entirely different factual issue. And I think we, on the conservative side, need to keep trying to push that distinction. Whatever the percentage is of transgender, it's well under 1%. And having it, the decision that you described doesn't really go to the question of using restrooms and the right of people who are anatomically one gender deciding they're the other. And I think the left wins arguments by lumping it all together and making it you're either tolerant or you're intolerant, and versus dealing with the fact they're very different things.
One of these writers was saying that we right now talk about these trauma triggers on college campuses because some people don't like to have certain questions asked. And then she made the argument, if you want a trauma trigger, think about a nude man in a woman's restroom.
Yes.
And since I have three women, in a locker room. Can you imagine what that would be? There's a trauma trigger if you really want one. We're going to take a break. We already have calls coming in, 1-800-351-1212. We'll get to some of those right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You may have noticed that often during a conversation about Islam, someone points out that radical Muslims are but a small percentage of the whole Muslim population. That is true, but there's another percentage that rarely gets mentioned, the percentage of Muslims who want to make Sharia law the official law of a country. A number of years ago, Pew Research interviewed nearly 40,000 Muslims in 39 countries concerning Sharia law. Let's start with the two countries where American troops have been for more than a decade. They found that 99% of Muslims in Afghanistan favor making Sharia the official law of their country. The same poll found that 91% of Muslims in Iraq also believe that Sharia should be the official law of their country. It will be hard to bring democratic values to countries where nearly all the citizens believe that Sharia law, not a constitution, should be the law of the land. If you look at the list of other countries, you'll see high percentages. 84% in Pakistan, 74% in Egypt, 72% in Indonesia. In nearly every country surveyed, you had a substantial majority that believed that Sharia law should be the official law of their country. If you come to the United States, the percentages are different because, number one, there are fewer Muslims in America, and number two, many Muslims have been willing to accept American democratic values. But that does not mean that Sharia has not been implemented, even here, on a limited basis. The Center for Security Policy published a paper a while back that identified 146 cases of Sharia law coming into conflict with American law. Granted, these are not major cases, but they still illustrate the willingness of Americans, both Muslim and non-Muslim, to accept some aspects of Sharia law. Radical Muslims may only be a small percentage of Muslims. However, the percentage of Muslims who accept Sharia law is a much larger percentage. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From PureFlix, God's Not Dead 2. A question about Jesus could cost Grace Wesley everything. In theaters April 1st, rated PG. God'sNotDeadTheMovie.com.
You're listening to Point of View. your listener-supported source for truth.
Weekend edition, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Privileged to have around the roundtable today Penna Dexter, David Georgatos, and Chelsey Youman. And we will get to some of those phone calls in a minute, talking about North Carolina, Georgia, and we sort of added Mississippi into the mix there as well. Some of the corporate bullies and this issue of sexual orientation and bathrooms and so many other topics, especially religious liberty. Penna?
Well, we could talk about the motivation of the corporate bullies. Debbie had a couple of thoughts on that during the break, but just to go to sort of the root, there was a discussion with Tony Perkins from Family Research Council about this, why the Obama administration and the left, because this comes down from the top. I mean, they have weighed in on some of the schools, forcing them to allow transgenders to use, any bathroom. And he said this is part of the radical sexual movement trying to destroy the whole idea of the fact that God created man and woman and that somehow we can choose, saying that we can choose what we're going to be. And we've talked about this before, way back at the United Nations when they were fighting over 5 genders. Well, there are way more they're talking about now. But it's the idea that we determine, self-determination, we determine what we are, and also breaking down sexual inhibitions, because you've got everybody in the locker room or the bathroom,
right.
And also moral and social chaos. And because of all of these things, it creates this chaos, which allows just another way of allowing a big government to come in and sort of organize things and be your authority, be your God in the culture and society.
So again, some very good reasons for all of that. Debbie?
Those are great points. I'm so glad you said those, Penn. I think they're really, really important. I was just going to comment that over the last 20 years or more in America, the now has been referred to as the LGBT movement, but the movement of the American left to change marriage or essentially destroy the right concept of marriage, they are more politically organized and have known for years it's not just pressure on individual businesses, but on very, very large businesses. The very large corporations in America, more and more of them will just accommodate the LGBT agenda because they're pressured. And the depiction often in the media is the LGBT are pushing, like the cases we're talking about now in North Carolina, other states, and dealing with RFRA. The entities that weighed in and said, you can't, to the governor, saying you cannot sign these laws, these are harsh. There's probably not a lot of people on the boards of any of those entities that weighed in, businesses or the sports entities, that personally are upset about this, but they get pressure from the LGBT community and they don't get enough sufficient or equivalent pressure from conservatives. It's not just pastors or just, churches who do not want these changes. It's the average American public, but even the public, Joe Q public, but even the public is a little bit pushed by the political correctness. I don't want to speak up. I don't want to say I'm the one. And so it's really a call to action for the average American to speak up on these things in your church, in your home, in your community, and in your state to say, no, I'm just Joe average. I'm not, I want us to have reasonable laws, at least with respect to these restrooms. There's no reasonable argument for the position of the LGBT community. None.
Right. In our pluralistic society, we've got to have the voices on our side who are standing up and saying, like so many of our clients at First Liberty, who say, I will think what I think, believe what I think I should believe, and speak and adhere to those beliefs. And the most ironic part to me in all of this, this corporate bullying, I guess you could call it, is that it's actually been proven that increased religious liberty in a society is better for business. And we believe, we've seen time and time again in societies and cultures where religious freedom is protected and is a priority for that culture. Other freedoms flow from that, freedom of speech, and that's why it's the first freedom in our First Amendment. Even it's been proven.
There have been offers in some of these cases. I'm referring to one specifically that I looked at in depth in Illinois, where it was in the school, and the school bent over backwards to accommodate a transgender kid who for years was demanding to be in the locker room, be on the sports team. I think this kid did get on the girls' team, but they tried to give him a private place to change. And that was not good enough. And that's the thing, is that even the extra expense of having a singular bathroom where people that are confused could use that bathroom, that is not acceptable. So it's not just that they might, I guess they don't want to feel in any way different. They're the same. We're all the same. We're all one big sexual mishmash thrown together in a culture.
Well, yeah, that was...
Oh, excuse me. It does seem that there has been a bait and switch here, but I think if you've looked at this human rights movement on their side, it wasn't ever just about marriage. It has always been about eradicating anyone who dissents. It's always been about what you're saying is identifying, I say what's truth. And it's not a principled truth. It's not a biological or ontological truth, but it is pure individualism run rampant.
You know, it's really interesting, too. The North Dakota dispute was very similar to that. The governor was, I think it was North Dakota, was about to sign the law. It passed the legislation and essentially said, similar to what you were saying, Penna, a moment ago, that in public schools, students had to use the restroom of their gender, of their biology. And so the law said, that would be the law in every state and for the schools, but that schools could, and in fact, I believe encourage them to have a gender neutral bathroom. So it could be used by any student with gender confusion or whatever other issue they would say. And they were touting it as such a reasonable accommodation for both sides. And I think the Heritage Foundation had helped work closely with them trying to advance this law. And it got up to the governor, and from pressure from the ACLU and other left-wing organizations you don't even think of as religious organizations or weighing in all that often religion, but it was the ACLU and other groups just said, absolutely not. This is not, and their wording, to both your points was, it's treating this student who was a boy anatomically, this boy as though she's not a real girl. It's like, right, exactly that what we're doing. But, it was this lack of common sense. And I go back to messaging or clarity of having the public understand better what these laws say. I don't think we would have nearly the momentum that the LGBT is winning right now if more people were tuned in.
Let's take a phone call or two because some of you want to talk about what are possible solutions. So we'll head up first to New Hampshire, WSEW. Vinny, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Yeah, Kerby, thanks a lot for your program, and I allowed your efforts at educating people, and your comments are spot on. Boy, you can't make this stuff up. It's just such a crazy world we live in.
I know it's April 1st, but this is not a joke.
Wish it was.
It's not a joke. If it wasn't so serious, it would almost be funny. But just like Paul said to the Corinthians in the end of the first book to the Corinthian church, we need to be alert. We need to stand firm in our faith. We need to act like men and be courageous. We need to be strong, but we also need to let everything we do be done in love, because if we don't have the right tone, we will not be received. So having said that, I think we need to be strong, but we also need to kind of stay above the fray and not wrestle around in the mud with them, but just try to maintain a higher position, because we do have a higher position, and we need to not apologize for our common sense beliefs.
Sure. We had some of the callers the other day talked about a boycott. What are your thoughts about that? Does that?
That's exactly what I was getting to.
Okay.
I was going to say some of these companies want to push people around in North Carolina. It's time for Christians to unite and maybe boycott some of these companies that want to push their weight around and see how they like the same treatment in return. And we can justify it. We can explain it. We don't have to, and we don't have to have 100% of the Christian population. We've got such a strong majority that's silent and trying to keep the peace. But I think it's time. The Bible tells us, as far as it is possible for you, keep the peace. But maybe it's not possible anymore to keep the peace.
Sure. I talked about the Disney Corporation, and they put a lot of pressure on Georgia and said they were going to pull out their film and movie productions out of Atlanta. At the same time, of course, they are opening another theme park in Shanghai, China, at $5.5 billion. And so they have all sorts of outreaches in China. And I love what David French asked the other day. Why does the Walt Disney Company prefer communist to Christians?
Kerby, I like the point that Vinny made about how we articulate this. This is a challenge for us as believers. This is one thing that I think is unique and different about Point of View and you, because you always have your facts, and yet you are always respectful to people, even people who disagree. And, I think that's something we all have to work on now, because we can sound really rough
Yes.
Like we don't have compassion on people that are struggling with their sexuality. I mean, and that, they can bring that back to us. So we have to figure out ways to have compassion for that person who's struggling and confused, and yet not allow their confusion and struggle to dictate our public policy.
Yes. Very well said. Let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to get into this in a little more detail. We have some information, and matter of fact, one of the commentaries I posted there by our good friend John Stonestreet on North Carolina and Georgia. We also have a lot more to cover, and we'll do so, but we'll also take some more of your phone calls, 1-800-351-1212. Weekend edition, we have a lot more to cover, and we'll do that right after this.
From PureFlix comes God's Not Dead 2. A classroom answer to an honest question about Jesus could cost Grace Wesley the teaching career she loves.
I would rather stand with God and be judged by the world than stand with the world and be judged by God.
God's Not Dead 2. Now playing. Rated PG. Parental guidance suggested. More information is available at godsnotdead.com.
In case you didn't know it, there's a presidential election in November, and it's shaping up like something out of Judges chapter 9 in the Bible. Our country is as divided as ever, and it's time for Christians to pull out our secret weapon. Yes, we must vote. Yes, we need to organize others to join us, but most important, we need to pray. We need to pray. Point of View will help you do that when you sign up for our Pray, Organize, Vote campaign at pointofview.net. Pointofview.net. Click on the banner, Pray, Organize, Vote. Stay informed. Get practical tools at pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Weekend edition with Penna Dexter, Debbie Georgatos, as well as Chelsey Youman. And let me just mention, if you're just joining us, that we're talking about some of these bills that have been before the legislatures. In one case, they were actually passed, HB 2 passed in North Carolina, and lots of pressure being brought on that state right now. In the other case, HB 757, which was passed but then vetoed by the Georgia Governor Nathan Deal. Now some people are talking about trying to override the veto. And we mentioned a little bit about the bill making its way through the Mississippi legislature right now, and the governor looking like, of course, he will endorse that and has actually spoken out on that. So those are some of the issues on the table right now. Of course, we're also wondering about the so-called corporate bullies. And let me take at least one more phone call in that regard. Dennis in South Carolina, I think you want to address that issue. So thank you for joining us today.
Yes, I understand why you want to call them corporate bullies, but I'd like to call them corporate extortionists because they're trying to extort by threats to make politicians who are elected by people to do their job. They're trying to threaten them and force them to do what the corporations want them to do. That's extortion. That's not just bullying.
Yeah,
I think
I get you. But they are free to do that, even in a free society. They're free to express their opinion. You know what? We're free to decide whether or not we want to go to Disney or whether we want to watch NBA games or NFL games or things like that as well. So, I mean, it's a free society. But again, what about this idea of extortion? Any thoughts?
Isn't the crime of extortion actually involves getting money?
Yes.
And so I know what you're saying. It is great pressure brought by private corporations that seems to have an undue influence over the majority of the voters in those states who chose those legislators who passed those laws. It's a small segment with a lot of power really overriding the power of the voters who chose that legislature. But I guess they're expecting to take money away, but they don't have a legal obligation to hold their business or conduct business in that state to start with. They could just say, we never go to North Carolina for whatever reason.
Well, and you've also got situations where they'll say we won't have a Chick-fil-A. We won't even allow a Chick-fil-A to be built in our state. You've seen some of those examples. So what I think we should be always saying is, can businesses just stay out of the culture wars? You may have opinions about this, whether you're Salesforce or whether you're the NBA or whether you're the WNBA or whether you're Disney, whether you're the NFL or whoever it might be. But just stay out of it, because when Lowe's gets involved in the sexual issues and when Salesforce says we're not going to actually locate any of our businesses in North Carolina, when Disney says I'm going to pull out of Georgia, we don't want that. I mean, we just like to have them stay out of the culture wars.
I wonder sometimes why they don't. I remember the Christmas wars where some of the big retailers, they stopped saying Merry Christmas. They stopped calling it a Christmas tree. And they learned over a long time, many years, that was not good for business for them. And so there's actually been a reversal on that now. And we don't have those wars anymore. In fact, Christmas is back in Target, amazingly enough. So, you have to wonder if maybe some of this will just work its way out over the years. I mean, I'm thinking the sports teams. That's the one that really has me scratching my head. I don't understand it.
They segregate big time. They have a
they
male
segregate,
team.
and they're usually especially the NFL. I mean, this is the symbol of manhood in the culture and in the country, and it's what young boys aspire to be, a football player, to go out there and tackle somebody.
Be a tough guy, yeah.
Well, be a tough guy, and so it's to me it's strange.
It is baffling, but if you pull back the veil, you'll find that a lot of the their Better Bureau ratings will actually go up if they're considered quote unquote more diverse. And so the LBGT, the HRC, Human Rights Campaign have gotten into that and help their rankings go up the more they speak out on these issues, which is obviously more money for them, better for recruiting. So the opposite would also be true. If faith-based minorities in our country, if conservative groups would come out and say, well, we no longer feel like that diversity includes us. We now feel threatened.
Yeah,
it works two ways.
There would be a great campaign just to say, I feel unsafe in your city. I feel unsafe in North Carolina. I can't send my daughter to college there because I'm afraid there'll be men in her. Turning it a little bit on their head. And your point, I love that, the Christmas wars analogy, but it took a long time, and it took individuals saying in the stores, I mean, I got in the habit of those stores that wouldn't say Christmas to go out of my way to Christmas. I'd say they would say Happy Holidays. I'd say Merry Christmas. I mean, because, it took so much of that, and it took too much time because it wasn't a focused enough fight back. Or maybe it could have been a better focused fight back.
Oh, good point.
And it was only once a year.
Well,
that's true. Yeah.
Let's at least hear from somebody in North Carolina, because since we are talking about North Carolina and Georgia, maybe James can tell us what's going on in his state right now.
Hey, my name is James. I enjoy your program, and I just called to say that I agree with the governor of North Carolina. You know, I don't think, and I sympathize with people who are struggling with their sexuality, but I don't think we should put women at risk by having people who might not be transgender and walk into bathrooms where and I don't think it's right. I just don't believe, that God intended that to be, and that's I don't mean to say this against homosexuality, but that's the only sin that God destroyed 2 cities over. Homosexuality is the only sin. It's unique. I know everybody say all sin is sin, but that's a unique sin in itself, homosexuality, because God destroyed 2 cities, Sodom and Gomorrah. It's an abomination to God. But I sympathize with people who are struggling with their sexuality, but at the same time, we're putting women at risk by doing this. And if you do anything, build another restroom or something.
Yeah, and then, again, that's kind of the common sense thing that we've been talking about here as well.
Homosexuality, I mean, in a sense, I used to struggle with that idea that it was a special sin or it was a worse sin to some degree. But in a way, it is more insidious because we're seeing it play out now, that it is being used now as a weapon against Christianity. And so if you have sexual rights and you bump that up against biblical religious rights, there are so many now that are getting power in the culture, in all aspects of the culture, that say sexual freedom wins over religious freedom. And that's, Liberty, or First Liberty Institute, is in that fight. I mean, you're not in the legislative fight, you're in the legal arena.
Absolutely. We are seeing that time and time again, where religious liberty, if you pit the two against each other, I believe it was Chi Feldbaum in the federal government came out and saying if they ever are pitted against each other, he thought of no reason why religious liberty should win. Well, the truth is religious liberty is actually a concept drafted in our First Amendment of the Constitution. One right came from court-created rights, realistically here, and then the other came from explicit rights in the Constitution. And we are seeing that debate, but I do think that there can be a way, both in a pluralistic society, everyone can work together. We just carve out conscientious objectors. Anyone of religious faith who has a belief on that gets statutory protections, just like in the pro-life movement. And in addition to that, we've just seen that people are. It is not just Christians. I think we categorize this a lot as a Christian belief. It's an Abrahamic faith belief. So anyone who is of Abrahamic faith, whether that's Jewish, Muslim, or Christian, and in fact, Buddhists and Hindus also have beliefs on marriage and that issue. Millions and millions of Americans have beliefs on these issues that are, I guess, countercultural in mainstream media today.
I think even just pushing the idea and talking about the idea that what we're standing at right now is a place where those who advocate same-sex marriage and LGBT rights and access to restrooms, there is no compromise. They have taken it's an amazing evolution in American society where for 30 years ago, people who were living the gay lifestyle were just seeking acceptance, or please leave us alone, let's live our lives the way we want to. And it has evolved to where it is an absolute insistence on everything we believe in must be accepted, must be protected by the courts, protected by the legislatures, and it's just there's no room for some balancing of religious liberty for people who don't want to bake a wedding cake for a same-sex wedding. That can be accommodated without having people who are who want to say, look, I have a right to get married. Yes, you do. But where we are kind of politically and legally is a place where that argument on the left is no accommodation for religious liberty should ever be recognized.
Even our clients, the Kleins, you guys have seen them, the Oregon Bakers, have experienced that firsthand. I mean, the government, and we're talking the administrative court of law, not the same court of law, levied a $135,000 penalty against them, garnished their personal assets. They went out of business. They're receiving death threats. There's no, as you say, there's no room for a happy medium or accommodation here.
No live and let live kind of philosophy that most of us follow, so we're certainly not seeing that. Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll take a few more phone calls, but in the second hour, we do want to recognize that we have a presidential campaign taking place, a possibility of a contested convention. And Chelsey, last time you were in here, you were saying maybe we'll have a contested convention. I think it's a much more likely possibility. And what about these rules, and would these rules change, and some of those issues? And, of course, also some questions asked about abortion to Donald Trump. So we'll have a lot to cover, but we'll continue taking some phone calls on this issue right after these important messages.
The plight of a 6-year-old girl is causing a stir in Santa Clarita, a community outside Los Angeles. The state of California and LA County recently removed her from the home of a Christian family with whom she's been living since she was 2. The reason? Race. The little girl's name is Alexandria. She goes by Lexi Page. She was taken from the home of Rusty and Summer Page, her foster parents, who want to adopt her but can't because they are not Native American. Lexi is like 1.5% Choctaw. Because Lexi has a Native American great-great-great-great-grandparent on her father's side, she was taken from the home of the Pages, who have lovingly parented her for going on 5 years, and their children, whom she considers siblings who love her dearly. A March 18th court order demanded Lexi be removed from the Page home and taken to Utah to live with a couple who may or may not be distant relatives of her biological father. Social workers carried a sobbing Lexi to a waiting car. Friends were there, some scolding, some singing hymns and praying. Now, when Zoe, the youngest Page, hears the doorbell, she says, "Lexi's home." This is all taking place under a federal law, the Indian Child Welfare Act, or ICWA, enacted 40 years ago to give Native American groups the right to take custody of children who can claim Native American ancestry. At 17 months of age, Lexi was removed from the custody of her mother, who had a severe problem with substance abuse, and has lost custody of at least 6 other children. Her father has an extensive criminal history, and despite reunification efforts, was unable to retain custody of Lexi either. The dad, with his minuscule Indian ancestry, is an enrolled member of an Indian tribe. Under ICWA, that makes Lexi Indian, and the tribe gets to say what happens to her. When Lexi was a baby, the tribe allowed her to be placed in foster care, in hopes she would be reunified with her dad. It became apparent that's a lost cause. So, the court, despite the wonderful results of loving and consistent parenting by the Pages, ordered that Lexi be placed where a couple of her dad's other kids have been placed, with so-called relatives in Utah, amazingly a couple who is not even Native American. Laws requiring a child's best interest be considered would apply here if Lexi were not 1/64th Indian. The Goldwater Institute is challenging the ICWA, saying it was written out of a concern that the state courts were breaking up tribes by placing Native American children to live off-reservation. But now, 4 decades later, the Institute's attorneys say the law penalizes Indian children by subjecting them to different and less favorable rules than other children. It's really discrimination against a child because she's got a bit of Native American blood. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Penna Dexter, Debbie Georgatos, and Chelsey Youman with us. And let's go out to Texas, KAVX. And Dale, what would you like to add to our conversation today?
Kerby, thank you. Well, I would like to, I heard a couple of times on the show that it's really important to articulate our position correctly, and I don't think we are articulating the position of what the left wants. Think back to the marriage decision by the Supreme Court, and in their minds, what they heard was not that two gay people or two men were getting married, but what if it was two blacks? What if just two African Americans were getting married? Well, in their mind, they equate this to the civil rights to such an extent that separate is not equal, and therefore to give a transgender person their own bathroom is violating that separate but not equal clause. They're treating it exactly like skin color and exactly like civil rights. And therefore, because they think of us as white Southern racists in the 50s and 60s, and they believe they are in the moral high ground.
Well, again, there is a difference between race and behavior. And Chelsey, you did a debate a while back where you tried to make a distinction about that between race and behavior. And if I remember right, some of the African-American students afterwards said, thank you for finally saying that there is a difference between the gay agenda and the civil rights movement of the 1960s.
Yes. In that debate at UNT, I was actually explaining to the student body there that it's ahistorical, frankly, to compare the two, and kind of offensive to the civil rights movement and everything that plight involved. It involved a civil war, 3 constitutional amendments just to try to even begin to eradicate the separation that had occurred. And even then, 100 years later, it still hasn't been completely rectified. And not to take away from the LGBT plight in our country, but it's just not, frankly, it's ahistorical to compare the two.
You know, just think about it as a Christian, as a believer, and the way we should think about this. I mean, we've got black people who, I mean, there's no sense in thinking about trying to convert someone from being a black person. But yet it would be a loving thing to do, to try over time to befriend a homosexual or transgender person, to tell them about Jesus Christ, to help them understand they can be free from that if they have temptation. They can trust God to help them walk a different path. And all of those things would be something that, I think God could lead us as individual believers to do. That would be a loving thing to do. So, if you're a believer, I think you could make this argument and talk about it in these ways. And yet there are many people who call themselves believers. Even Nathan Deal, the governor, mentioned when he was discussing this that he has faith and he practices his religion, and he felt that the compassion towards the transgender was necessitated by his religion. And so obviously, there are a lot of Christians, if he is in fact a believer, that just don't understand their faith well enough, and they allow these distortions to come in and affect their decision making.
There's also another aspect of this that's interesting to bring into any discussion about it. There's some notion that this, and with respect to this transgender issue, that this is kind of like being black. You were born that way. You're just born black and you can't change it. And so people will say about the transgender argument that they couldn't possibly be choosing this status because it's so unpopular and very difficult to handle. So it's trying to make the argument kind of born that way. But there actually is, there have been several cases recently where doctors, actual professionals, have come out. In one particular instance where the pediatricians who came out recently, there was a report, and I believe it was in the National Journal of Pediatrics, talking about the idea that parents of young children who say, well, you say I'm a girl, but I really think I'm a boy, or vice versa, that parents who indulge or engage in any encouragement of that, especially with respect to parents who have actually gone along and permitted some kind of gender-altering drugs or drugs that will help prevent the normal physical development, that those parents say these pediatricians are committing child abuse. And there's another study I read about, or it was a paper by a woman who, she said as a young woman, as a young child, she really wanted to be a boy. She thought she was a boy, and her parents they weren't mad at her, but they didn't really indulge it. And she said most children, she's now a psychologist and a sex therapist, said most children will grow out of that by their teenage years. And so to indulge it and encourage it, you're planting or fomenting or nourishing that seed just in the way you wouldn't want to nourish a child who said, I can't help it, I'm hot-tempered. You wouldn't say, well, okay, then go ahead and have a temper tantrum. You would help them. And there's a really important notion. We shouldn't just agree that whatever the LGBT transgender advocates say is true. It's okay to look at some of the doctors' input on this too.
You're good.
I do have one last thing to add. The caller mentioned Obergefell, the same-sex marriage decision, and I will say that the court actually declined to create a protected class. They could have rendered the decision in a way that equated same-sex attraction as a protected class, the same as race. And they chose not to do that. They chose the other route, which was to say the right to marriage is a fundamental right. And so I would say the court even limited its analysis in that regard and frankly upheld a lot of the First Amendment. There was a great paragraph in there where Kennedy said religious objectors should feel free to continue, course.
But it's amazing how you take a court decision that's, it was very nuanced. There was language in there, even language I think that was in the brief from First Liberty about religious liberty continuing to be protected. But, that is ignored by the left. When they want something, they just move forward as if it's true. I mean, we've watched our president do that on many occasions with many issues. They move forward. They almost will it into existence, act as if it's that way. And eventually, sometimes it does become then part of the Constitution or the body of law.
Let's take another phone call real quickly. Go out to California, KYCC. Frank, I think were talking about letters to the editor. I'd love to hear from you.
Hi, Kerby. Thanks for taking my call. I just wrote a letter to the editor about what happened in Georgia. I'm a pastor out here, and I write a lot of letters, and I thought I'd share it with you. It's real short, and then I'll hang up and let you carry on with your show, if that's all right.
Sure.
Okay. Georgia's Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which passed both the Georgia Senate and House, was vetoed by Governor Nathan Deal under pressure from many corporations doing business in the state and from the NFL. For example, the Walt Disney Corporation threatened to pull out of Georgia, and the NFL threatened to eliminate Atlanta for future Super Bowl site consideration. In the end, money, popularity, and political correctness trumped religious freedom. This bill, which was a very watered-down version of its original content, would have simply given pastors the right to refuse to officiate a gay wedding because doing so would have violated their religious beliefs. Sadly, this anti-Christian thought is pervasive across the country. The bottom line is that the right to exercise our religious beliefs, i.e., biblical Christianity, is no longer valid in the United States. Our current culture has denigrated to the point that the Church of Political Correctness has been established as the state-mandated religion, and anyone who dares to go against this religion will pay dearly. Biblical Christianity is now seen as an enemy of the new top tolerance and of the progressive agenda of our culture. If a Christian baker, florist, photographer, or pastor refuses to render their services for a gay wedding because of their biblical beliefs, they are now considered enemies of tolerance and acceptance and are treated as criminals.
All right, how much more do you have? We're just about out of time here.
No, I just got one more sentence here.
Okay.
The First Amendment has, in a sense, been rewritten to say Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion unless it is the religion of political correctness or prohibiting the free exercise thereof unless it is biblical Christianity, or abridging the freedom of speech unless it is stating biblical truth.
Well, again, wish I had a little more time, but we're coming to a break. We'll get into some of that in the second hour and also maybe widen the conversation because we have a possibility of a contested convention, not only for the Republicans, but now Bernie Sanders has been doing pretty well, maybe even the Democratic Party. That is really amazing. By the way, it is interesting, but Donald Trump needs, 61% of the delegates. Bernie Sanders only needs 63% of the delegates. So it could be interesting both in Philadelphia and Cleveland. We'll talk about that right after these important messages.
Columbia Pictures presents, in association with Affirm Films, Miracles from Heaven. When 10-year-old Anna Bean develops a rare incurable disease, her mother devotes herself to finding a solution.
Miracles are everywhere.
Then, after Anna has a freak accident, a miracle unfolds. How do we explain the impossible? Miracles from Heaven, starring Jennifer Garner, now playing. Rated PG, parental guidance suggested. More information is available at miraclesfromheaven-movie.com.
How critical is the 2016 election? Well, the next president will very likely appoint at least 2, even 3 Supreme Court justices. Our on-budget debt is approaching $20 trillion, and the threats of war and terrorism all too real. Given these things, we're asking you to pray for our nation and to educate and encourage others to get involved. Sign up today at pointofview.net. We'll send reminders to help you pray, organize, and vote. Pointofview.net. Click on the banner, Pray, Organize, Vote. The future of America is at stake. We need to pray. Pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour of Weekend Edition. If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Penna Dexter, Debbie Georgatos, and Chelsey Youman with us. And we're going to continue the conversation we've had about what's been happening in Georgia and North Carolina, but expand it now to look at election 2016. Today, of course, voting in North Dakota. On the 5th, Wisconsin. And that's a big one because, indeed, 42 delegates at stake for the Republicans. Winner take all could be very significant. And to show you how things have turned around, last time the Marquette Law School poll was conducted, Donald Trump was ahead 30%, had 30% of the Republican primary voters, with Ted Cruz at 19%. It is completely flip-flopped. Now it looks like that Ted Cruz has 40% of the likely Republican voters, and Donald Trump has 30%. If that continues, as it would, and if that poll is somewhat accurate, it means that Ted Cruz gets all of those delegates of a winner-take-all. And it makes it even less likely that either Donald Trump or Ted Cruz will come with the requisite 1237 to the convention. Chelsey, last time we had you on here, you were saying that we might have a contested convention, and I loved you for that, because a couple of weeks before, your boss, Kelly Shackford, said, no, there's not a chance of a contested convention. I think so far you look like you're right.
I've been saying that for quite some time. If you just break it down to sheer numbers, there's quite a few winner-take-all states ahead still to go, but he is about, Trump specifically is 501 short of the 1,237 he needs. So the idea that he's going to get all of that, I know that Cruz is gaining a lot of ground in the popular vote. And so if we end up at the convention, I do think all bets are off. I have no clue what will happen once we get there. I know there's speculation that Paul Ryan might become involved, or the GOP might support Mitt Romney. I know that Rubio actually has been calling his delegates and sending out letters of support to his delegates saying, don't free up quite yet, because he might be back at the convention.
Yes, well, okay, so that brings us down to, hope this doesn't get too much into the weeds here, Rule 40B. And Penna, you and I have been listening to some of the things that Morton Blackwell has been saying. I've listened to him on other programs, and he's been on this program. We'd talk about trying to get him on this program as well. But
that would have been great to have him on today, but you should have him on soon.
We will do it soon. But this rule was put into effect, and tell me if I've got anything wrong here, in the 2012 election, so that Mitt Romney could prevent Ron Paul's name from being put into nomination, because the rule requires that you actually, as a candidate, have to win a majority of delegates in at least 8 states. Well, if indeed that rule stays, there's only 2 people that you could possibly hear from at the convention. That is Donald Trump and Ted Cruz. That eliminates John Kasich. It eliminates Ron Paul. Some of the other individuals that might be there, as well as Paul Ryan and all those individuals. They're just not possibilities. And so you're down to really just 2 people.
I remember 4 years ago, I was at a conference right before the Republican convention in Tampa, and they were talking about this rule, and, a lot of the conservatives were upset. The Paul supporters were very upset because this was really aimed at him to try to keep him out, because he didn't have very many, but they thought at a convention anything can happen, which is the same thing we're saying now. Rule 40B is in effect now, and I think we would have had to get, really drill down with Morton Blackwell to find out what can happen with that rule. It was passed right before the actual convention happened. So could they go and reverse that rule right before the convention in Cleveland? I'm not sure, but I have heard Morton Blackwell say that this is what quote unquote establishment people might do. And that is, right now there's this 8-state minimum. So if you don't have a majority as a candidate in 8 states, then you're not even eligible to be on the ballot, to be voted on in the second ballot at the convention. And so Morton said, well, what's to stop people that are in the party from just changing that number? Like, for instance, finding out how many states Kasich is going to win. And then, because maybe Kasich's the one they want. And then just dropping that minimum down to that number right before the convention, and then be elevated. Someone who hasn't, has he won a state? He won Ohio.
Yeah, Ohio.
That's it.
Yeah. So, things like that could happen. But
Mm-hmm.
what's happened, when you look at this, it's kind of funny almost that rule, it was to be used against Paul supporters, is now actually, in some people's minds, being used against these quote-unquote establishment candidates and for the outsider Trump Cruz type candidates.
Nobody saw that coming. By the way, we probably will get Morton Blackwell on, and I know that we got Kelly Shackelford on next Friday. And, of course, he has been not on the Rules Committee, but he's been on the various Resolutions Committee and things like that. So we'll kind of get a little more insight. And there's a lot of time between now and July anyway. But any thoughts about this, Debbie?
Yes, I think there is obviously a lot of speculation in the media about who, if the GOP really wants to fight, whoever wins, assuming there is not any candidate who in the very first vote gets 1,237 votes. And if they do, that's the end of it. If any of the candidates, really Trump or Cruz, got there with that number, that's over. But we're all assuming no one gets to 1,237. I think the GOP, much as they cannot stand either of those two candidates, they did not want to have this outsider push that's happened in this primary cycle. I think that there's great fear within the GOP that bringing in somebody like Romney, who lost last time, like Paul Ryan, who's got a serious primary challenger, I don't think they'll dare do it. I think I'm kind of a small group of people. It isn't that I think the GOP has that much honor they wouldn't do it. I think they'd be afraid of the voters. We're looking at 80% of the voters total pretty much between Trump and Cruz do not want the insider candidate. 80% of the GOP primary voting base, and the idea that GOP would dare to put a new person in, I just don't think they'll go there. And I think that also, this whole delegate thing, there's been a lot of talk about how, well, the voters don't really pick the presidential candidate, the delegates do. But the delegates, at least in many states, and in Texas, in particular, we happen to be in Texas, they are chosen by the voters. They're not just randomly. In some states, they're chosen by the party, and that might be a different thing. But the delegates go with a sense of responsibility to follow what they're supposed to be doing. So I think if they don't get to 1237, this last thing I'll say on it, but I think it's really important. Once these delegates are up there and no one's won on the first ballot, all those delegates need to be able to look at their ultimate goal should not be to make sure candidate X or candidate Y wins. It should be that the GOP candidate will beat the Democrat candidate. That's got to be their goal. They are there to represent the party. And so they've got to look at things like who in polling is showing they will easily be beat by Hillary Clinton. Who's showing they have a chance to beat her? They can look at trajectory, trends, numbers, and even who could possibly beat the Democrat opponent. Those are all legitimate considerations by the delegates up there.
If people want to make a difference, now's the time. They could actually be a delegate and make a huge difference, especially if, as Chelsey says, we go to a contested convention. The candidates that have people seated on the committees, the Rules, Platform, Credentials Committee, they will be an advantage. Candidates that have a lot of people, delegates that like them. Now, if they may be committed to one candidate, but after the first ballot, some of them might have had their minds changed about the candidate they're committed to. So if one candidate has a lot of delegates going to the convention and has a good ground game in getting that, they're at an advantage.
Let's take a break, but at least 3 of us around the table have lived in California. Remember how when you voted in the past, it didn't mean anything? When they vote June 7th, those 169 delegates might make the difference. And they're now even saying that the Virgin Islands might make the difference. That was the front page of USA Today. And if not, a contested convention. I think it's a possibility. We'll talk more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You may have noticed that often during a conversation about Islam, someone points out that radical Muslims are but a small percentage of the whole Muslim population. That is true, but there's another percentage that rarely gets mentioned, the percentage of Muslims who want to make Sharia law the official law of a country. A number of years ago, Pew Research interviewed nearly 40,000 Muslims in 39 countries concerning Sharia law. Let's start with the two countries where American troops have been for more than a decade. They found that 99% of Muslims in Afghanistan favor making Sharia the official law of their country. The same poll found that 91% of Muslims in Iraq also believe that Sharia should be the official law of their country. It will be hard to bring democratic values to countries where nearly all the citizens believe that Sharia law, not a constitution, should be the law of the land. If you look at the list of other countries, you'll see high percentages. 84% in Pakistan, 74% in Egypt, 72% in Indonesia. In nearly every country surveyed, you had a substantial majority that believed that Sharia law should be the official law of their country. If you come to the United States, the percentages are different because, number one, there are fewer Muslims in America, and number two, many Muslims have been willing to accept American democratic values. But that does not mean that Sharia has not been implemented, even here, on a limited basis. The Center for Security Policy published a paper a while back that identified 146 cases of Sharia law coming into conflict with American law. Granted, these are not major cases, but they still illustrate the willingness of Americans, both Muslim and non-Muslim, to accept some aspects of Sharia law. Radical Muslims may only be a small percentage of Muslims. However, the percentage of Muslims who accept Sharia law is a much larger percentage. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From PureFlix, God's Not Dead 2. A question about Jesus could cost Grace Wesley everything. In theaters April 1st, rated PG. God'sNotDeadTheMovie.com.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Might just mention that we have links to all the websites here. You can find out more about Penna Dexter. Debbie Georgatos, of course, has written the book and is the host of the show Ladies Can We Talk? And that's coming up tomorrow, Sunday night. I'm always getting it wrong.
Sunday, yes.
Sunday night. And then Chelsey with First Liberty. So again, we have some of those links, and we've been talking about the Republican convention. And before we move on to some of these other issues, I thought for just a minute we'd talk about the Democratic convention. And of course, ever since the issue of superdelegates surfaced, it would look like it was pretty much a foregone conclusion that Hillary Clinton would get the nomination. She has 467 superdelegates. Bernie Sanders has 26. So when you start out with that kind of lead, then you can lose a fair number of elections and primaries, which Hillary Clinton has. But now the Sanders campaign is saying we're going to try to convince some of those superdelegates to change from Hillary to him because he's winning. And Hillary Clinton was a senator from New York, if I remember right. Right now, she's behind 4 points behind Bernie Sanders in her home state.
In New York. Well,
is that amazing?
Her fake home state,
yeah,
but yes.
Yeah, okay. All right. And since you're a New Yorker, you could say that, right?
That's right.
Yeah, you were born in New York, so go for it.
Yeah, this is the most interesting election cycle on the Democrat side because you'd think if you just had, no pictures or names, but you just read a resume, you had one person who'd been a Secretary of State recently, not 100 years ago, but recently, just finished that, a U.S. Senator, a former First Lady, revered by many people in the women who are on the more left-wing side of America, that she should and she's running against a gentleman who's in his early 70s or mid-70s. He is an admitted socialist. He, if you look at his resume, never had a job in his life till he was 40. I mean, no job at all. You think, this won't even be close, but Bernie Sanders has made it close, and it's just an astonishing thing to watch. So I think part of what it signals is there are a lot of people on the American left who vote in Democrat primaries. There are some who just love the free college message of Bernie Sanders, the students who say, yeah, free college. But I think it's a lot of people just saying, I don't like that my two choices are these, and I really don't want to support Hillary Clinton. I think there are people just turned off by her conduct in her life. You could list all the scandals, and some still current, ongoing. But I think that there is a lot of, so it's an amazing thing to watch right now. And the fact that she could possibly lose her adopted home state of New York would be breathtaking. I don't think she'll lose it, actually, but.
Kerby, you've explained the superdelegate phenomenon before on the show, but one question I have that maybe others might have the same question is how would a Bernie Sanders or somebody else get superdelegates to change from Hillary? How do you do that?
Well, they are unbound. So first of all, she has 1,600 delegates. He has about 900 in round numbers. And so the superdelegates are, first of all, a fair number of them are uncommitted. There's 700. And if you do the math, 467 plus 26, you realize there's still a fair number that are uncommitted. But even those that are committed to Hillary Clinton, they're unbound. These are in cases, for example, Walter Mondale, who was the presidential candidate in 1984. He's a superdelegate. Many of the governors that you would know right now, we just mentioned Cuomo a minute ago, and those individuals are superdelegates. And then many of them are party regulars. And if this indictment comes down against Hillary Clinton, some of them might say, well, I'd rather go with a guy that's not indicted rather than keep my pledge to go with somebody who has been indicted by the FBI. So they're kind of the
experienced people in the party.
Yeah, and to be fair, there are a very, very few Republican superdelegates, but there's a difference. They are supposed to vote with their state. In other words, Governor Abbott, for example, Greg Abbott would be a superdelegate, but he would vote for Ted Cruz. Well, he would anyway, but he would because that's the way the state voted.
Does he have any more clout than any other delegate?
No. So the Democratic issue is really one where I'm surprised the Democrats have put up with this over the years, because you want to talk about party establishment. Mm-hmm. This was established back in 1984 after the Mondale debacle, in which they said, we just cannot allow the voters to have the final authority. We lost in 1972 with Walter Mondale. We lost with George McGovern. We lost in 1984 with Walter Mondale. So we need enough party regulars, enough old hands to determine whether or not those people that voted carefully and correctly. So it's, again, you talk about...
I think if some Republicans are going to want that, if the Trump phenomenon ends up with him the nominee.
Indeed happen. If the Republican Party wasn't so grassroots, I think it probably would have happened a long time ago.
It's that sense that the Democrat side, the large number of superdelegates they have, it is that ruling elite thought that just the voters really are just not quite smart enough to figure this out. So in case they get off track, we'll fix it. And I really do hope the GOP would be resistant, even if we end up with a candidate that the GOP establishment doesn't like. You got to resist the idea, I think, or the temptation to say, let the ruling elite take over. That's just exactly the opposite of what the GOP, which is a grassroots party, is supposed to stand for. And really it's unprincipled as you look at what the Constitution tried to do to give the power, and the Declaration of Independence, to give the power to we the people. That we tried to get rid of the ruling elite, the ruling class in America.
Yeah, well, that has been the history of the Republican Party since I'm the oldest one around the table again. We'll talk about that. In 1960, John Kennedy did not win more than just a few primaries. One of them was West Virginia. And that's when the power brokers of the Democratic Party said, we're going to give it to John Kennedy, but we're also going to make sure he has Lyndon Johnson as his VP. The same thing happened in 1968, and they gave it to Hubert Humphrey. And so then when they said, well, we'll let the people decide, then in 1972, they had George McGovern, and that was a disaster. And like I said, after 1984, when Ronald Reagan just swept over Walter Mondale, that's when they said, okay, we're going to take back control of the party. We're not going to allow just the voters to determine who the nominee is. And if that was happening in the Republican Party right now, you would have full-scale revolt, wouldn't you?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And I don't want to undermine either. I think the media does kind of undermine the implications that her indictment would actually have on the outcome of who the candidate is. I think if she doesn't drop out of worry about her own reputation, then absolutely Bernie would be able to take up and her delegates would be freed. However, if she stays in, the popular vote might have been a little bit different. We would have had a different outcome.
You know, you put a piece up, Kerby, at pointofview.net by Monica Crowley, who I find interesting sometimes, in the Washington Times? Yes. And you talked about the the Obama sort of support that was sort of understood for Hillary. And all of a sudden, there's some sense that there's a breakdown in that.
Yes.
And what has happened? Do they know something we don't know about her indictment? Or, you know, why? Yeah, probably do. So is that shattering, falling apart? Is Hillary going to be more on her own? Big question.
Well, and again, the fact that they've been talking with the IT specialist, Brian Pagliano, and he could name those who had access to this server. He could testify to the security of the server. And now they're finding that not only through that server were they receiving classified documents, they were sending them. Mm-hmm. Now, I got two lawyers sitting here. You know, it's one thing to receive a classified document and say, well, I just didn't know it was classified. It's another thing to send one, right, that you know is classified. That, I think, is the last shoe to drop, isn't it?
Right. That helps go towards intent, which is typically one of the harder things to prove in these types of cases. And additionally, let's not forget, they've already withheld many emails. So we know that there are classified emails, and they offered this individual, they offered him kind of a sanction of sorts to come out, to come out and talk, which says it's not just Hillary that could be indicted for all of this. Don't forget, it's her staff and anyone with knowledge of what would have happened. So he very well could be escaping his own indictment in this way. I think they've got a lot on her. And I also want to emphasize this is under the Espionage Act. So we're talking a felony here. This is a federal felony. No one has thrown that word around in the media. The penalties go upwards of, they can go up to 10 years, or it can be some of these penalties.
Are you saying the penalties for this young man or for Hillary?
For Hillary.
Because he's got immunity. Yeah.
Yeah. You know, I'm so glad you said that. I was going to say something about this whole Hillary email thing. There's been so much talk in the media, and I think if you're not a big email user and you don't know what setting a server up, you might think it has to do with something like, well, she clicked on the wrong account, or she by mistake used the wrong account to send something. So it sounds like technological ignorance, or unintentional. But this really is, and I'm glad you mentioned the Espionage Act, this is about national security. It's about the security of people who give their lives. They're working undercover for our government. They are foreign nationals. They're American citizens. This is actual identity of people who are risking their lives for America. And you think how upset you'd be if your bank, just as a simple example, your bank, you feel trustful that you go online, you make transfers, no one can see it, but if someone were using, with responsibility at the bank, were so laxed in the procedures that anyone could access this, you'd be furious at your bank. Well, this is national security and systems set up to protect people violated for years by Hillary Clinton.
Well, again, we'll take a break, and then we'll take some more phone calls. 1-800-351-1212. Also, after some phone calls, also get into this issue of should we penalize women if they get an abortion after it is declared illegal. A lot of hypothetical there, but that didn't stop MSNBC and Donald Trump from interacting on that. So we'll get your comments right after this.
From Pure Flix comes God's Not Dead 2. A classroom answer to an honest question about Jesus could cost Grace Wesley the teaching career she loves.
I would rather stand with God and be judged by the world than stand with the world and be judged by God.
God's Not Dead 2. Now playing. Rated PG. Parental guidance suggested. More information is available at godsnotdead.com.
In case you didn't know it, there's a presidential election in November, and it's shaping up like something out of Judges chapter 9 in the Bible. Our country is as divided as ever, and it's time for Christians to pull out our secret weapon. Yes, we must vote. Yes, we need to organize others to join us, but most important, we need to pray. We need to pray. Point of View will help you do that when you sign up for our Pray, Organize, Vote campaign at pointofview.net. Pointofview.net. Click on the banner, Pray, Organize, Vote. Stay informed. Get practical tools at pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily Kerby Anderson.
Weekend edition, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Penna Dexter, Debbie Georgatos, and Chelsey Youman. And you can certainly watch online, and you can go to our Facebook page, see our picture, and all sorts of things that are happening behind the scenes. Let's, if we can, go to Georgia for just a minute. Ellie, I think you want to talk about the issue of Hillary Clinton's emails, so you have the floor.
I do. I don't think that Hillary Clinton feels she has to answer to anybody. And neither does Bill, for that matter, neither one of them.
Well,
I believe that...
When you haven't had to answer for all the things that have happened before, you can see why they would have that mindset, don't you think?
Absolutely, and I can go way back. I believe, this is my opinion, suspicious circumstances around the death of Vince Foster and Secretary of Energy or Commerce, Ron Brown. Suspicious, and even about the Benghazi situation and the lying that went on. And I'm sure if they trace back the money that Hillary Clinton has in their foundation, quote unquote, I'm doing air quotes, that could be traced back to all kinds of malfeasance. People that are giving millions of dollars to them that they will owe favors of some kind. So I believe that both of them should be in the penitentiary and not back in the White House. And I can't believe that this country elects her to the White House. I am contemplating moving somewhere. I just don't know where.
We've heard that before. Any comments?
Well, she mentioned so many of these scandals back from the Clinton years. And they're going to be revisited definitely in the campaign. If Hillary is, in fact, the nominee, it's going to be an education for a certain generation of Americans who haven't, read the history of what happened back then and didn't live through it as some of us who are a little bit older did.
Yeah. We have someone around the table that maybe wasn't even in grade school when some of those things happened.
But I think she knows all about it.
I think my parents muted the TV during that part.
Yeah, and a lot of us,
and so we have
tried
younger
to
voters that have never heard about
kids.
this. That's the
but
thing.
We do. We have a big contingent of the voters in the
Mm-hmm.
Democrat Party who don't know. And I think that some of that generation, if I know them fairly well, and you've studied them, Kerby, might be bothered by some of this.
Yes, I think so.
I'd be concerned.
I certainly hope so. I do know that a lot of them are putting their support behind Bernie. Even talking to someone I know this week who is a self-proclaimed libertarian is now voting for a socialist. So who knows what my generation will do when push comes to shove. But one good thing about the Hillary Clinton investigation is that a lot of it is out of her hands. The FBI essentially performs the investigation and then makes their recommendation to the Attorney General's office, which is under Obama. It's essentially his decision, Loretta Lynch's decision, whether they're actually going to charge her. I think public opinion and outcry might really put them between a rock and a hard place where they're faced with no other choice than to charge her.
Also, Senate committees investigating her, two of them.
Yeah.
I think a very hard thing for the Democrat Party to deal with at that point, if the FBI's clear conclusion is she certainly should be indicted, and President Obama can review it and he may agree that's true. But at this point, they are not going to. I don't think President Obama or the Democrat establishment could really could stand the idea of having Bernie Sanders as their candidate. So they're in the same place, the GOP, thinking, who else can we shuffle in here? Who else? I mean, there's obvious talk about Joe Biden. He would be another 4 years of Obama. He's been as VP, but they're in a real mess, too, if that happens. And they've also got to be calculating how much, even if the FBI says, yes, she should be indicted, and then if Loretta Lynch doesn't indict because President Obama doesn't want her to do that, how does that hurt her in the election? Is she going to be so damaged by this? She should have been indicted that, he's smart as to let her get indicted. I was going to say a real quick thing about the FBI guy, Comey, this guy
James
who's
Comey. Yeah,
FBI was, It's just interesting. He's been around in Washington a long time, and he was actually a deputy special counsel to the Senate Whitewater Committee. And those of you under 30 need to look that up. Senate Whitewater Committee. In 1996, after months of work, he came to the conclusion that Hillary Clinton was personally involved in mishandling documents and had ordered others to block investigators as they pursued the case. And he saw her behavior along with her husband's within a pattern of concealment. And so this is guy, FBI head James Comey, who's seen Hillary and her husband operating the way they operate for years and years. And this is what a lot of older voters know about Hillary and her husband. It's always above the rules. Laws don't apply to us. March forward. I think that a lot of people, I agree with you, Penn, a lot of people will revisit these issues. And I also think the way she has attacked the women with whom her husband had extramarital liaisons, this is not going to sit well with the young generation, the younger women.
Well, actually, the way she's covered up for him, I think also. I mean, she's a feminist, quote unquote, but she did not perform a feminist role as a wife back then. You know, I mean, I think that it's good to keep your marriage together, but
she was an enabler.
She was a complete enabler. And, you know, the fact that they got away with everything back then, and she was then elected senator and all of that, you know, I just don't know how that translates today. I do not know, but there is this possibility. I think that fresh eyes on some of this it's going to, you know, make people wonder whether they really want this back in the White House.
Yes. 2 weeks ago, I did a commentary, and a lot of that came from our good friend, Dr. Merrill Matthews, as well as Mukasey, who was an attorney general. And what they were saying is, what if, and is most likely, the FBI does recommend an indictment, but the attorney general, Loretta Lynch, does not? What happens? And there's two possibilities. One possibility is that you have all sorts of resignations, and those of us that lived through the 1970s remember when you had the Watergate scandal, Elliot Richardson and William Ruckelshaus all resigned. But more and more people are saying, no, that probably won't happen because James Comey's not going to resign. He's wanted to do this all of his life. And as a matter of fact, Rudy Giuliani the other day said, no, he won't resign. What he'll do is release all of this information. And that will damage Hillary Clinton worse than if she was actually indicted, because then they'll just start leaking it, all the information they have about the people that died because of the information. And so in some respects, an indictment might be better for Hillary Clinton than a non-indictment where then the FBI director is just letting all that information out. That would just ruin her campaign, don't you think?
Absolutely. I think there are people who just want to be idealistic. You know, it's interesting. No political party is a monolith. It's made up of many different kinds of voters. And I think there are a lot of salt of the earth, hardworking people who've always voted Democrat because they think the Democrats stand for the little guy, or they help the little guy, or maybe because they've always had a job in a union. But these people love America and they want a good, strong, moral leader. And I think there are a lot of groups of Democrat voters who say, I just can't do it this time, given now what I know about her life and her conduct. I just can't do it.
Maybe the Republicans ought to try their best to give them a good choice then.
Amen.
Right. And to keep in mind that this is not a partisan attack of any sorts. This is an evidentiary attack against her, and it's something she's done. It is the FBI's involvement, and I think it says a lot that they are even involved at all under the Obama administration. So it's not a partisan issue. It's probably more of a character issue on her part.
Absolutely.
And that hopefully
Absolutely.
Democrats will recognize that, and I don't know if she'll have many options besides to bow out.
Yeah, don't know either. I want to change the topic because the abortion issue certainly surfaced in the campaign, and love to get your thoughts about this. Of course, there was maybe a little bit of a blind side to Donald Trump, who hadn't really thought about the issue. But Penna, help us out here if indeed, and this is a lot of what ifs. What if we have a situation in which abortion is no longer a national issue because the Roe versus Wade has been overturned? Then you have states that might actually have a criminal penalty. But in all cases, I'm hearing people talk about there might be a criminal penalty against the abortionist, not the woman. What about these issues?
Chris Matthews brought up the question to Donald Trump, and it turned into a very interesting interview where Donald Trump said, yes, at some point there might be or should be a penalty for the woman. And he was pushed on that, and he kind of stuck to it. And this turned out to be really rough for him for the next few days. His campaign had to reverse those statements, and it brought a firestorm from, of course, women in the Democrat Party, but also on the Republican side, the pro-lifers. I mean, the pro-life movement has not been about that. Mm-mm. The pro-life movement has been for women and babies. They're both victims. And it's interesting because I think it just shows his naivety on issues. Mm-hmm. I don't want to give him a pass at all, but I think that he is not convicted on the abortion issue. The abortion issue is a political position he's taken, And so he was saying what he thought was going to be the the right answer to get the conservative vote. And it wasn't the right answer. And the Wall Street Journal said, this is Trump's campaign, their daily policy adventure. He's on a learning curve here. And, it just helps me to understand that even as president, you're just not sure what you're going to get.
Well, and again, we went through this a little bit back with Ross Perot. You kind of got the sense that, again, never having run for political office, kind of making it up as you go along. And you had a little bit of that with Ben Carson, maybe a little bit with Carly Fiorina, although she had run for Senate. And there's a sense in which going through the grind gives you a chance to maybe know how to answer some of those questions. But I want to hear from the other women, but I've got one of those mandatory breaks. So when we come back, we'll get your comments about Donald Trump's answer and what would be maybe a little bit better answer right after this.
The plight of a 6-year-old girl is causing a stir in Santa Clarita, a community outside Los Angeles. The state of California and LA County recently removed her from the home of a Christian family with whom she's been living since she was 2. The reason? Race. The little girl's name is Alexandria. She goes by Lexi Page. She was taken from the home of Rusty and Summer Page, her foster parents, who want to adopt her but can't because they are not Native American. Lexi is like 1.5% Choctaw. Because Lexi has a Native American great-great-great-great-grandparent on her father's side, she was taken from the home of the Pages, who have lovingly parented her for going on 5 years, and their children, whom she considers siblings who love her dearly. A March 18th court order demanded Lexi be removed from the Page home and taken to Utah to live with a couple who may or may not be distant relatives of her biological father. Social workers carried a sobbing Lexi to a waiting car. Friends were there, some scolding, some singing hymns and praying. Now, when Zoe, the youngest Page, hears the doorbell, she says, "Lexi's home." This is all taking place under a federal law, the Indian Child Welfare Act, or ICWA, enacted 40 years ago to give Native American groups the right to take custody of children who can claim Native American ancestry. At 17 months of age, Lexi was removed from the custody of her mother, who had a severe problem with substance abuse, and has lost custody of at least 6 other children. Her father has an extensive criminal history, and despite reunification efforts, was unable to retain custody of Lexi either. The dad, with his minuscule Indian ancestry, is an enrolled member of an Indian tribe. Under ICWA, that makes Lexi Indian, and the tribe gets to say what happens to her. When Lexi was a baby, the tribe allowed her to be placed in foster care, in hopes she would be reunified with her dad. It became apparent that's a lost cause. So, the court, despite the wonderful results of loving and consistent parenting by the Pages, ordered that Lexi be placed where a couple of her dad's other kids have been placed, with so-called relatives in Utah, amazingly a couple who is not even Native American. Laws requiring a child's best interest be considered would apply here if Lexi were not 1/64th Indian. The Goldwater Institute is challenging the ICWA, saying it was written out of a concern that the state courts were breaking up tribes by placing Native American children to live off-reservation. But now, 4 decades later, the Institute's attorneys say the law penalizes Indian children by subjecting them to different and less favorable rules than other children. It's really discrimination against a child because she's got a bit of Native American blood. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Again, this is important not only for the presidential election, but for our pro-life listeners out there. And Debbie, of course, I want to encourage people to be listening Sunday night to Ladies, Can We Talk? Yeah, but also the issue is, how do we answer questions that might like that come up? If indeed abortion is illegal, what are our answers about what would be criminal penalties to the abortionist or the woman?
Do you want to quick recite what it is Donald Trump said? He was asked by Chris Matthews, and essentially, if abortion were illegal, should a woman be subject to criminal prosecution? That's not the right
Yeah,
exact
do you
words,
believe in
but-
punishment for abortion? Yes or no? Donald Trump says the answer is there has to be some form of punishment. And Matthew says for the woman, yes, there has to be some form of punishment. So that's kind of how he responded to that in the midst of just all sorts of kind of cacophony of noises and voices and everything at the midst of that. Yeah,
and he was being pressed. Chris Matthews wasn't going to let him go. But, the short answer is I think for, leaving it aside entirely the legality abortion thing, if you are in the public light and you are on the conservative side, you have to assume the media is trying to trap you, trying to make you look small-minded, selfish, anti-woman. And so being a little bit savvy about that. And anytime you're asked a hypothetical question, it's perfectly valid to say, that's just not a realistic question. That's not where we are. So I can't really answer that. I haven't been there to see that. But the great answer would have been for him to, and anyone in this situation, to not respond to the hypothetical precisely, but to say, look, here's where I am on this subject. If I'm elected president, I would use the bully pulpit of the presidency to speak about the value of life and to urge support for the pro-life position. Just go to the positive, but don't get sucked in and answer a question that's a silly hypothetical.
Somehow that doesn't sound Trump-esque, but no. I wonder what people think, and maybe a caller or two might want to weigh in too, is what kind of damage does this do? Because the campaign did reverse his statement and say that, no, we wouldn't prosecute women-only doctors. But does he leave? I mean, this was an egregious misrepresentation of the pro-life movement and what it's been about. And the pro-life movement has been very successful over the years. It's grown. It's reduced the number of abortions. It's changed opinion among the next generation. So for him to come and say this kind of thing, it's actually affirming the left's stereotype of the pro-life movement that they try to portray.
Another war on women, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And so, if he does end up the nominee, does that cause ultimate damage to the pro-life movement, or do we just take Trump as who he is, a little bit uneducated, learning, and give him a pass?
Yes, I will agree with you. That was one of the most frustrating parts of this, is I do think conservatives understand, just from a policy standpoint, some of the best ways to reinforce our pro-life stance is to, in fact, take better care of women and the unborn. And, in the state of Texas, they had HB2, where they increased medical conditions and requirements to help protect women who essentially there were no medical standards whatsoever for an abortion. And to protect women, the policy way to reinforce that would be holding medical examiners responsible who wanted to do that or participated. It wouldn't be to punish the woman. It would be to come around the woman, help her in her circumstances, and provide her mechanisms and the help that she needs to be successful.
Let's take some phone calls. We'll head out to Illinois, WPEO in Peoria, Illinois. And Karen, what would you like to add to our conversation today?
Hi. I have several comments I could make on all the subjects you're talking about, but this is really about the businesses that don't want to cover birth control and basically, even taking away abortion, although, I'm not really for that, but I don't think things are being considered as, like, the men. They never have to pay anything until the actual baby is born. So it's all on the woman to pay for any medical. If she becomes sick or hospitalized, that's all on her. Then breast pumps aren't usually covered under that. Also, men get to have erectile dysfunction drugs paid for by their insurance.
Yeah, okay.
What's your point?
Yeah. I think we lost her, actually.
I'm sorry, my phone is acting up, so I can't tell if you're still on there or not. I'm on a cell phone.
Okay. So your point is that we should be more fair to women. I'm hearing you say.
Well, yes, I just think that if if the businesses don't want to cover birth control and say that that's wrong, why are we covering erectile dysfunction medicine?
Yeah, again, there is all sorts of lack of common sense in that. But Penna, start us off here.
Well, the reason that a business would not want to cover birth control is because some forms of birth control do work by abortifacients. Mm-hmm. And so the life of a very early developed unborn child is taken. And in certain businesses, that would be that would violate their faith. And so even with the Hobby Lobby decision that protected businesses, we're still looking at the decision for nonprofits that don't want to cover that under the Little Sisters of the Poor, that case. So that's the reason. And, I've got a couple of brand new grandchildren, and the breast pumps have been covered for under their insurance policies for the moms and things like that. So, I don't know that discrepancy is there. It's the violation of religious faith and conviction that is at issue here. It's not an equality issue between men and women.
I agree completely. And actually, with respect to insurance generally, once you could get the federal government out of the healthcare business, all sorts of health insurance policies and companies will respond to pressure, the normal free market pressures. I'm unaware whether they actually cover erectile dysfunction drugs or not. But the larger question of just free market should permit insurers to cover what they want to cover, let pressures come from their customers to say, I'm moving to a different company because they provide more. I don't think there's some discriminatory overlay to the insurance policies in the country.
Right. I would definitely frame this in terms of conscientious objectors and religious people of faith. Little Sisters of the Poor is essentially about the federal government forcing nuns to provide abortifacient contraception.
You cannot make this up.
It does not get more simple than that. It does not make sense. And if the government wants to be everyone's big brother, and if they want to require all of these exorbitant fines, they should take over and provide it themselves. And that is essentially the Little Sisters of the Poor's request was, we don't want to have to authorize you to hijack our plan and use our insurance policies to provide the drugs. If you want to do that, make it its own independent policy on the exchange. And so that will come out shortly. We have a few clients as well who are nonprofit entities that are also waiting to hear that decision.
Let me just mention, we're just about out of time, that first of all, Penna Dexter's commentary you get a chance to hear today, and if not, it's on our website, and we send it out, and if you haven't signed up to get the Viewpoints commentaries that I write, and she writes, those are available. Ladies, Can We Talk on Sunday night?
Yes, it's 6 to 8 p.m. Central Time. If you can go to ladiescanwetalk.org online and hit listen now, you can listen to it live anywhere in America.
And we have that link there. And First Liberty, again, all sorts of religious liberty issues, including some of the ones we've been talking about today, right? Absolutely.
FirstLiberty.org is our website. And you can hear more about our cases and the clients and all of those cases that are up.
Wasn't this a great round table here with very smart women all around me? I've been very privileged to have them across from me, so thank you for being with us today.
Thank you. It was fun.
Let me just mention real quickly on our website some of those things we just talked about here. We have some opportunity for you to let your elected representatives know what you think about whether we should have confirmation hearings for this nominee for the Supreme Court, and so we give you that opportunity. We have the Viewpoints commentary, Penna's today, on removing Lexi. You've got to read that. It's a fascinating story there, and all the commentaries that are available. And of course, we have our Pray, Organize, and Vote. And for many of you that are listeners, especially in states like Wisconsin and Connecticut and New York and Delaware and Pennsylvania and Rhode Island and Indiana and Nebraska and California and New Jersey and many other places, you still are going to have a chance to vote. So we have some of those resources available to you on the website, pointofview.net. I want to thank Andrew, Catherine, and Shamila for their help. We'll see you back here after the weekend.
Columbia Pictures presents, in association with Affirm Films, Miracles from Heaven. When 10-year-old Anna Bean develops a rare incurable disease, her mother devotes herself to finding a solution.
Miracles are everywhere.
Then, after Anna has a freak accident, a miracle unfolds. How do we explain the impossible? Miracles from Heaven, starring Jennifer Garner, now playing. Rated PG, parental guidance suggested. More information is available at miraclesfromheaven-movie.com.
How critical is the 2016 election? Well, the next president will very likely appoint at least 2, even 3 Supreme Court justices. Our on-budget debt is approaching $20 trillion, and the threats of war and terrorism all too real. Given these things, we're asking you to pray for our nation and to educate and encourage others to get involved. Sign up today at pointofview.net. We'll send reminders to help you pray, organize, and vote. Pointofview.net. Click on the banner, Pray, Organize, Vote. The future of America is at stake. We need to pray. Pointofview.net. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just thank God for y'all.